Hello folks, so today I wanted to try something quite different than my usual sparring highlights video. I wanted to take the time to take a step back and review how I have developed as a fencer over the last 4.5 years of doing hema longsword. I started my hema journey in the spring of 2017 after finishing my bachelor's. At the time I had a lot of free time on my hands and nothing to do over the summer. So I decided to try out sword fighting because I've always enjoyed swinging sticks and tricks around. Needless to say, I quite quickly got very serious about doing hema, more so than anything I've ever experienced before or after, and hopefully I'll be able to keep this motivation and engagement with hema for many years to come. But without further ado, let's get started. So, the first footage we're going to be looking at is from the Dutch Lions Cup of 2018, which was my first big tournament. I remember at the time I was very nervous about going into this tournament, and on top of that I was also exceedingly cocky about my own very limited abilities at the time. As you can see from the recordings, I had an unfortunate tendency to use the Geislau, one-handed sweeping strikes to the legs, very often. And now looking back at the fighting, it's clear that the reason I used the Geislau so much was because I was really not confident in my fencing style at the time, and this was also, like I mentioned, my first time in a very stressful environment, that being a tournament. So I think actually the use of the Geislau represents my mental state at the time quite well. I was willing to take these high risk, low reward attacks and just keep spamming them because it was the only way I could ever score any kind of hit, which in the end doesn't really pay off unless you know exactly what you're doing, which I really didn't. One thing that's worth noting is I unfortunately did accidentally injure someone with the Geislau during this tournament, which really was an eye-opener for me, and I really had to go back to the drawing board and rethink my entire fencing style after that. Another major flaw in my fencing style at the time is my tværhavs, the horizontal strikes from one side to the other. The way I execute them in this tournament is essentially I'm twisting my entire body around whenever I want to strike, rather than just crossing and uncrossing my arms, which is how they're supposed to be done. One last criticism, which isn't so much my style but more my preparation for the tournament, is that I came to the tournament with a brand new jacket from a different, well, not brand, but different style that I'm used to. Before the tournament I was fighting a lot with with a Spec AP jacket, and I just got a brand new Spec Hussar jacket. And the ones of you who know this, there's a huge difference between these two jackets. I'll touch up upon this a bit later, but just word of advice, never ever show up to a tournament with brand new gear. Always make sure to have them tested at least once, if not twice or thrice, before you use gear for tournaments. At least jackets, legs and gloves. Alright, the last thing from the tournament of my own style I really want to harp on is my leg work. I am really slow, sluggish, I pay almost no heed to distance or tempo. This is especially obvious in this last fight with Henrik Jensen, who's a really good fencer. At the time we'd been doing hema for about the same amount of time, and he is just dominating me because he's got so good control of the distance and he knows what he's doing, as opposed to me. So to wrap this up, DLC 2018 was really an eye-opener for me in terms of how far I had come and how far I really needed to go before I could consider myself somewhat even competent. But it was a welcome eye-opener. Like I mentioned before, it made me go back to the drawing board and really rethink my whole way of fighting, my style, what I wanted to achieve and how I wanted to achieve it. So it was a really good experience to have, although I did get my ass handed to me quite tremendously. So, this next part of the video is just from our ordinary club sparring sessions during 2019. The first thing that you will note is that I have switched out my Hussar jacket for a Arkham jacket. And the difference between this Arkham jacket and the Hussar is the difference between, in an RPG sense, switching between heavy armor and light armor. The Hussar offers excellent protection, it's very sturdy and you almost never get bruises in it. But this comes with the price of a limited mobility and flexibility, which was especially obvious at my DLC fights, because normally I really want to raise my arms quite high because I'm a short guy. With the Hussar I just couldn't do that, which is why I reverted back to Geiselhaus and shitty Zwerhaus. And now with the Arkham jacket, that's a very light jacket. You get bruises so easily and you feel every hit. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it does train you to take hits seriously and try to make sure you don't get hit. Moving on from the jackets, as you can see, my fencing style have improved. I am using a variety of different attacks and guards, and I move between those slightly more fluid than at the DLC. I'm also a lot more confident in my stance and the way I fight in general, so I don't rely as heavily on cheap strikes like Geiselhau anymore. One thing I can point out now, looking back, is that at this time I was a very reactive fencer, as in I often presented a bait to my opponent essentially, and I waited for them to take the bait, which can work, but the problem is if your opponent just ignores your bait and goes straight for you, I had a tendency just to get a whack in the face. Also, I do make quite big and telegraphed strikes as last hits. It can work, but it's not a good way of doing it. So wrapping up, I have improved my distance and my stance entirely. So overall my fencing style is much better, so I'm happy with that improvement at least. Now this next video segment is courtesy of Daniel Oliver Sutter from Switzerland. We did some sparring after Swordfish 2019 in Göteborg. So many of the same points still apply as in the last segment. I move more fluidly between guards, and I'm much more active, both my legs and my arms. And I tend to use a variety of different guards and attacks. One thing that starts appearing here in my style is my feints, and also not just basic feints, as in going for one opening and then striking the other, but also these big feints where I lift my arms up high and I present a very visible threat to my opponents. The point of these is to make your opponent panic. So I go up, I present a very visible threat, and then I switch my arms from side to the other, make my opponent guess which side I'm going to strike on, and as soon as they commit to one side, I strike to the other side. It is a risky play because I leave my entire body open. The only part of me that's slightly covered is my head, and that's covered by my arms. So even if they strike towards the head, they'll still hit my arms. I do manage to land quite a few hand hits with this kind of attack, but the hands are actually not the intended target. The reason I hit the hand is because Daniel is so good at retreating so I can't take his head, so instead I just go for the hands. So overall, for 2019, quite happy with how my style developed. I'm, like I mentioned before, much more fluid, much more confident, and I use a much wider variety of attacks and moves, which helps me stay away from just being a noob that spams Geiselhau all the time. So for this last segment there is a bit of a time skip of almost a year and a half, but that's because, well, 2020 happened and nothing good came out of 2020. So we're skipping ahead to 2021. This is some club sparring at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde, and one thing to have in mind is that in November 2020 I took a very bad fall on my left knee, and I'm still recovering from that actually. So my leg movement have been somewhat impaired by that. But apart from that, I'm still quite confident that my fencing style is relatively solid. As you can see, I am much more aware of distance and tempo now. I use it a lot to trick my opponents into getting, well, not cheap strikes, but getting into distance and making attacks that might surprise them. One thing to note is that I have a very clear focus on going for the head, which means I often do end up doubling, which are never a good thing, but I try to rationalize that if I take the opponent's head and they get my arm or my leg, it's a worthwhile trade. So it is something I'm working on getting better at. Well, not doubling out, but it can be hard, especially like Matteo here. We haven't trained together for that long, so we still have to get used to each other's style, which is probably why we get so many doubles, because both of us go in for hits, even though one of us at least should recognize the danger and be more defensive in that case. I am still a quite reactive fencer, even though I have gotten better at being offensive. I do prefer to stay back, let my opponent make a mistake, and then capitalize on that. If there's one thing I really want to improve, it's my thrusts. I have quite weak thrusts and I don't trust in them, which often means whenever I thrust, I immediately go to a Tværhav halfway through my own thrust, instead of just committing to the thrust and hoping it lands. So that's definitely something I need to work on. But apart from my thrusts, I am overall pretty happy about my developments as a fencer. I still have a long way to go before I'm content with my own style and my own level of fencing. But it is at least nice to see that I am making some improvements over the course of a few years. So 2020, fencing wise, was a underwhelming year to say the least. 21 is looking slightly up, but still not great for me. I'm hoping once the world reopens that I'll be able to go out to do more training events and tournaments, and I'll of course make sure to upload videos from my tournaments and also the sparring I do at training events, just to keep you folks updated on what I'm doing, how I'm improving, and how my fencing looks. But yeah, I think that's all I have for this one. Like I mentioned before, I have come quite a ways from my first tournament at DLC. I still have a very long way to go, but I'm happy to see that there's been development, and I hope that you enjoyed the video and that you will be interested in following my development along. So goodbye and have a nice day.